Japan has been, throughout history, an incredibly intriguing and fascinating place from the point of view of the West. When Portuguese explorers led by Fernão Mendes Pinto arrived in Japan in the mid-16th century, they were initially met with curiosity and interest by the Japanese, which was reciprocated by the Europeans. Two civilizations which had grown independently into mighty empires had just met, despite being isolated for thousands of years from one another. The Portuguese recognized traits of their idea of civilization: traditions, customs, houses, temples, clothing, art, and the like. Yet the world was so alien to them, so unbelievable. Portugal was impressed by Japan's culture, technological advancements, and organized society. They admired Japanese craftsmanship, such as the production of swords and ceramics, and recognized the sophistication of Japanese urban centers and governance systems. As Christianity gained popularity among certain segments of Japanese society, Portuguese observers began to view Japan through the lens of its reception of Christianity. For many Europeans at the time, the acceptance or rejection of Christianity became a measure for a society's level of civilization. It was this train of thought which was more or less the basis for European racism before social Darwinism caught on after the Enlightenment. In the eyes of the Portuguese and most of their European counterparts, if a society rejected Christianity, then they must be barbarians. But if a people were able to be converted in large numbers, then they must be civilized people. This sort of sentiment carried on throughout the Age of Exploration, which was why when the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity in the 17th century, European views of Japan shifted from seeing the island as this mystical, civilized, fantastical kingdom on the other side of the planet to a barbaric enemy of Europe and a conquering empire. These sentiments were reflected in art and writing and didn't really subside until around the Russo-Japanese War, wherein Japan was accepted once again as a power on par with the Western empires. If we want to see firsthand those initial, more infatuated sentiments of the Europeans upon arriving to Japan, one of the best sources is the record of the life of the first Englishman to travel to Japan, William Adams, who also had the honor of being one of the first non-Japanese samurai. Adams, historically, became an advisor to the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. He helped the shogun construct Western-style ships and train the Tokugawa army in the use of Dutch cannons. He went on to join the Tokugawa army and fight in the Battle of Sekigahara, which secured their control over Japan. He then served as an advisor to the shogun and was granted a status as a samurai, living out his days on the island as a samurai merchant. For the last few weeks, I've actually been watching this show on Hulu called Shogun. It's a work of historical fiction based on a massive novel written by James Clavell, which itself is based on the life and writings of William Adams. I highly recommend both the book and the show, which, despite receiving the Hollywood flair, is still an incredible story in its own right, and fairly accurate as a period piece. Now, is this long intro just an excuse to talk about William Adams and the TV show based on him? Yes, but there's also a really important conflict that occurs in this show. In the show, the previous shogun died before his son came of age to take the position. As an interim measure, the shogun created a political council to govern Japan called the Council of Regents. The council is made up of 5 feuding regents who have been divided essentially into 3 camps. The 3 Christian regents, and then Lord Yoshi Toranaga, who is loyal to the old shogun and his son who is still in training, and then Ishido Kazunari, guard of Osaka Castle, who is not Christian, but also aligns himself with the 3 Christian regents for selfish reasons in order to take power. This conflict got me thinking. What if the Christian regents somehow managed to take power? Perhaps not specifically the characters from the show, since one is a leper, one is greedy and a fake Christian who's only in it for Portuguese money, and the third is pretty ineffective. No hate on the leper guy, by the way. His character is seriously cool, but I doubt he would be a very stable ruler. Anyway, I had this train of thought about how a ruler in Japan might emerge who took it upon himself to spread the Christian faith. This idea begs the question, what if such a ruler took power? What if, in an alternate timeline, Christianity's influence spread far faster and far greater in Japan? Before we begin, I'd like to give a major shout out to the Baron of Madness, one of our channel supporters, and a huge help in the writing and preparation of this video. If you want to be part of the creation of some of these alternate history scenarios, or if you just want to have a better chance at getting your video ideas on the to-do list, consider becoming a member on Patreon or via channel memberships. Now, onto the video. Our story begins in southern Japan, where from 1586 to 1587, a conflict of conquest was fought between the Otomo clan and the Shimazu clan. This conflict, known as the Kyushu Pacification, saw a fractured Shimazu clan, whose leaders were fighting for control, win a series of battles and expand its territory along the Shimabara Peninsula and further north. The Shimazu clan was intent on unifying the region of Kyushu under their rule, wiping out the Otomo clan and other minor clans in the process. Otomo Soren, head of the Otomo clan, began a diplomatic process at Osaka Castle to plead for intervention from the emperor's chief advisor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was sympathetic to Otomo and ordered a ceasefire with the authority of the imperial court. The only problem was, during this period, the Emperor of Japan didn't have direct control over the militaries of the various daimyo, and couldn't exert much influence besides ceremonial and diplomatic power over the daimyo. By the way, the daimyo are the feudal lords of each of the different clans in Japan. Now, the emperor's advisor, Hideyoshi, presented the Shimazu clan with a proposal that would let them keep all of their conquests in southern Japan except those against the Otomo clan. The Shimazu, obviously, rejected this offer and continued their attacks with the goal of unifying Kyushu. In June of 1586, Yoshihisa Shimazu himself, leader of the Shimazu clan, invaded and attacked the Otomo clan's castles one after another in their clan's capital region. The emperor's advisor had enough of the squabble by now and ordered the subjugation of the Shimazu clan. He dispatched forces from the Mori clan, a very powerful clan in southern Japan. On advisor Hideyoshi's behalf, the Mori clan engaged in a long series of fierce battles to push back the Shimazu expansionists. Hideyoshi formed a coalition alongside Sengoku Hideisha, Sogo Masayasu, and Chosokabe Motochika. The coalition weakened Shimazu forces, and eventually Hideyoshi and his half-brother Hashiba Hidenaga launched the siege of Kagoshima, leading to Shimazu's surrender and the total subjugation of the Kyushu region by Toyotomi Hideyoshi and the imperial court. Not long after, Hideyoshi issued the Baturin Expulsion Order, which regulated Christianity in Kyushu to prevent Portuguese influence. There was a particular reason for this persecution of Christianity in the south. Otomo Soren, head of the Otomo clan, with whom Hideyoshi was allied, was himself a Christian. Though they were allies, Hideyoshi recognized that the Otomo clan was, to a degree, under foreign influence. Since their domain was strategically located, the Otomo were able to control key trade routes and maintain a comparatively massive military presence in the region. This also saw Otomo interact far more with the Portuguese than other clans in the region. During his reign, Otomo Soren was baptized as a Christian and given the Portuguese name Francisco. He ordered the destruction of Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines in his domain, which greatly pleased those same Portuguese Jesuits. He also ordered the forceful evictions of Buddhist monks and Shinto priests from their religious sites, which were then reused as Christian structures. The Otomo clan and its province's subjects were made to convert to Christianity, and not long after, Soren and his samurai began a purge of Shinto temples in Tsuchimochi, in modern-day Miyazaki. Soren's goal was to establish a Europeanized Christian society in Tsuchimochi and expand his clan's dominion. In addition to his expansionism, Soren sent a political delegation to Goa, the Portuguese colony in West India, and eventually a diplomatic mission to the Pope in the form of the Taisho Embassy in Rome in 1582. So Soren wanted to foster a trade relationship with the Portuguese and profit off of Chinese goods imported by the Portuguese from Macau. It's here we see a debate over whether or not Soren was truly a Christian. Some scholars argue he was simply an opportunist, like many other Christian daimyo of the time, who wanted to profit off of Portugal's trade empire. However, the desecration of Shinto and Buddhist temples and Soren's efforts in Tsuchimochi persuade me otherwise. Regardless, it was his special relationship with the Portuguese and with Christianity that caused Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the emperor's advisor, to issue the anti-Christian Baturin Decree. He saw foreign influence as an insult to the emperor and dangerous to his personal goals. That's because Hideyoshi was actually one of three key figures in Japanese history, called the Three Great Unifiers. That would be Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Oda Nobunaga, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. So we come to a crossroads. How do we go about the expansion of Christianity in this alternate timeline? Simple. Have Otomo Soren align himself with unifier Oda Nobunaga and continue the Nobunaga legacy in his own right. Oda Nobunaga was a powerful daimyo and ruler of the Oda clan. Nobunaga's early years were marked by strategic alliances and military campaigns to consolidate his power base in the Owari province. He used imported Western firearms, a relatively new technology in Japan, to devastating effect, earning him the fearsome reputation on the battlefield. One of Nobunaga's pivotal achievements was the defeat of the powerful Takeda clan at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, where he coordinated volleys of gunfire to secure victory. From then on, Nobunaga became an almost unstoppable force in central Japan. He implemented land reforms, encouraged trade and commerce with the Portuguese, and supported the arts. Most importantly, Nobunaga tended to have a favorable attitude toward Christianity, which was partly motivated by his desire to weaken the influence of powerful Buddhist monasteries, which posed a threat to his authority. He saw Christianity as a potential counterbalance to the dominant Buddhist institutions and their political power. Despite not being a Christian himself, Nobunaga granted protection to Christian missionaries and even supported the construction of churches, forming alliances with Christian daimyo, including, of course, Otomo Soren of Kyushu. The conflict with the Buddhists boiled over during the Ishiyama Honganji War between the Nobunaga and the Iko-Iki, a militant Buddhist sect centered around their fortress at Ishiyama Honganji in Osaka. The Iko-Iki, who were supported by the Mori clan and the Ashikaga shogunate, were religiously fanatic, militant Buddhists who challenged the daimyo in central Japan. Nobunaga launched multiple campaigns against the Iko-Iki to weaken their influence, including the aforementioned protracted siege, which I have difficulty pronouncing, which lasted for over a decade. In 1580, the Iko-Iki surrendered and Nobunaga began to turn against Christianity, seeing it as just as potentially undermining a force that the Iko-Iki had been. Perhaps, however, in our alternate timeline, Otomo Soren, given his connections to the Mori clan and resources from the Portuguese, is actually able to assist Nobunaga in the pacification of the Iko-Iki to a greater degree. With Portuguese weapons and a massive military from Kyushu, Soren would move rapidly to meet with Nobunaga in Osaka. Nobunaga commanded a well-trained army of samurai and was supplemented by the forces of Sakuma Nobunmori, Niwa Nagahide, and other minor commanders. Combined, they fought with a force of about 30,000. From the south, Otomo Soren would bring his contingent of Portuguese cannons and so-called Christian weapons, which would allow, in our alternate timeline, Soren and Nobunaga to bombard the Iko-Iki strongholds, including the fortress of Ishiyama Honganji, from a distance, without incurring heavy casualties, before their main assaults on the fortress. The Iko-Iki peasant militias were commanded by warrior monks and samurai sympathizers from the Ashikaga shogunate and the Mori clan, as I already mentioned. They held an advantage in their defensive positions, but their allied forces in this alternate timeline would quickly evaporate in the wake of Otomo Soren's diplomatic maneuvering. As the battle progressed, Soren would leverage connections with the Mori clan to sow discord among Mori supporters of the Iko-Iki, ultimately leading to the Mori clan's withdrawal from the conflict. This would greatly reduce the size of the Iko-Iki's defensive contingent, bringing the war to a quicker end. Otomo Soren's diplomatic efforts would solidify Nobunaga's control over the region, furthering his ambitions of unifying Japan. Soren's strategic contributions would bring him favor in Nobunaga's eyes and reverse his waning support for the Christian daimyo, who he now saw as tactical allies. Nobunaga's ambitions would be cut short only 2 years later, however. On June 21st, 1582, Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, where he had lodged while preparing for an upcoming campaign against the forces of the Takeda clan. However, while he was at Honnoji, a betrayal unfolded that would change the course of Japanese history. Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's generals, who had previously been loyal to him, suddenly turned against him. Taking advantage of Nobunaga's vulnerable position in Kyoto, Mitsuhide launched a surprise attack on Honnoji with his forces. Some accounts claim he committed seppuku, others state that he perished in a fire lit by Mitsuhide's forces, but nonetheless, Oda Nobunaga passed away, leaving a vacuum of power in Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, in the aftermath of the death, saw himself as the immediate successor to Oda Nobunaga. Tokugawa was initially a vassal of Nobunaga and had served him faithfully. However, after Nobunaga's death, Tokugawa quickly assessed the chaotic situation and sought to forge alliances with other powerful figures to strengthen his own position. He formed an alliance with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the aforementioned advisor to the emperor, who unified Kyushu. Tokugawa immediately consolidated his forces and attempted to continue Nobunaga's expansion. Otomo Soren would see, in this alternate timeline, Tokugawa's rapid ascension to power as highly suspicious. Soren would see Tokugawa as a false inheritor of Nobunaga's legacy. Instead, he would reason, it was his calling as a powerful Christian daimyo to unify Japan, not Tokugawa. Perhaps the power vacuum was a divine gift from God, an opportunity to spread the Christian faith across the Japanlands. His first move required an ambitious request, an audience with Go-Josei, Emperor of Japan. Soren would meticulously prepare for a formal entourage journey to Kyoto, the seat of the imperial court. He'd select respected emissaries and officials from his domain to accompany him, assuring they're attired in lavish traditional garb befitting their status and observing the proper protocols and customs to demonstrate reverence for the imperial court. Soren's goal was to attain the emperor's favor against Tokugawa Ieyasu. By stoking the imperial loyalists and presenting Tokugawa as a usurper to the entire Japanese system, both the current Ashikaga shogunate and the emperor himself, Soren could potentially form a mighty coalition against Tokugawa. He'd paint a dire, perhaps somewhat embellished, picture of Tokugawa's designs for unchecked power and domination, portraying him as a threat to stability and the sovereignty of the entire realm. Emperor Go-Josei took into account Soren's words, but he was generally indifferent to the politicking of the daimyo. Thus far, Tokugawa had not proved himself a hostile enemy to the emperor himself. Even in spite of his hesitations, however, Emperor Go-Josei would remember this interaction, planting the seeds of paranoia in the very back corner of his mind. To move forward with his plan, Soren would invest heavily in trade with the Portuguese, taking a particular interest in importing gunpowder and Western weapons from the Christian merchants. The Portuguese assumed that they could, through trade, exert greater control over Japan and potentially take over the islands as a colony in their empire. This assumption was, of course, impossible, but it nonetheless prompted the Portuguese to ramp up trade to meet the demand in Japan for Chinese and European goods. Soren would also seek an alliance with the Date clan in the north, who might be of use in the future. Soren met with Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of Oshu, whose clan controlled the north of Japan. Masamune was a unique leader among the daimyo of Japan. In our own timeline, about 30 years later, Masamune would assist in the launching of the Keicho Embassy in 1613, an embassy across the world to establish relations with Spain and the Papal States. Masamune was a patron of the arts and culture, and he collected artworks from across Japan, China, Korea, and the West. He, like Soren, was open to trade with the Portuguese, but he wasn't a Christian himself. Kind of like Oda Nobunaga, he also allowed Jesuit missionaries to operate in his domain, which caused a considerable minority of Christian Japanese to hold some sway in Date. Soren, for the sake of our alternate timeline, would convince Masamune to form an alliance with the Otomo clan and the southern Christian daimyo. The Christian daimyo in the north and south, who were mostly concentrated around Date and Otomo territory respectively, and acted as essentially buffer states for those clans, were considered to have honor penalties among the non-Christian daimyo due to their religious conversions. Since Date had no honor penalty but was still open to cooperation with Christians, he would be a valuable ally for Soren, especially to maintain his imperial favor. Only shortly thereafter, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would also pass away, leaving yet another power vacuum that the final of the three great unifiers, Tokugawa Ieyasu, would exploit. Tokugawa capitalized on disagreements within the Toyotomi government, particularly between Ishida Mitsunari and other prominent figures like Kato Kiyomasa and Fukushima Masanari. By fostering dissent and redirecting animosity towards Mitsunari and his allies, Ieyasu weakened the cohesion of the Toyotomi clan, the same clan which had acted in the emperor's favor for more than half a century by now. Tokugawa actively recruited disaffected members of the Toyotomi loyalist faction, including former allies of Hideyoshi like Kato Kiyomasa and Fukushima Masanari. He propagated rumors of assassination plots and conspiracy theories implicating Toyotomi loyalists, which served to discredit his adversaries and justify his own consolidation of power. In one such instance, Tokugawa alleged there was a conspiracy to assassinate him involving Maeda Toshinaga. His actions fractured the Toyotomi government and allowed Tokugawa to undermine his political enemies, many of whom happened to be imperial loyalists like Isshiya Mitsunari. In the emperor's gaze, Tokugawa had poised himself as loyal, but his actions caused the Emperor Go-Josei's suspicions, which had been planted by Soren, to grow. Ultimately, Tokugawa's splintering of the Toyotomi government led to the outbreak of the Battle of Sekigahara, where he attacked Toyotomi loyalists in the largest battle Japan's feudal period had ever seen. With this, Emperor Go-Josei would be convinced, and would condemn Tokugawa as a usurper, not unlike Toyotomi had condemned the Shimazu clan at Otomo Soren's request only years earlier. The Battle of Sekigahara on October of 1600 was a bloodbath. Many neutral daimyo watched from the hills surrounding the battlefield in terror as Tokugawa eliminated a force 1.5 times the size of his coalition. Tokugawa purged the Toyotomi and Nobunaga loyalists in a horrific battle obscured by foggy and rainy conditions. In the wake of the massacre, Emperor Go-Josei sent loyalist daimyo to take out Tokugawa, including the Otomo, Date, and other Christian daimyo. Amidst the mist-shrouded hills west of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu with his eastern army marched towards Kyoto. Tokugawa's eyes lay fixing on the horizon, enveloped in the light of the rising sun to the east. The light bathed a growing hill in the distance, a hill which somehow shifted and changed form. As Tokugawa neared closer, he realized this was no hill. With the rising sun shining behind them, a coalition of disparate forces gathered in front of Tokugawa, united by a common cause, to preserve the emperor's rule and defy any would-be usurpers. With a fiery crackle, Soren's cannons were lit, piercing the air and landing on Tokugawa's position, scattering his forces. The booms echoed off of surrounding hills, interrupting a roar of yelling and clinking armor. Tokugawa's forces, numbering around 88,000, took cover and retreated to more defensible positions. Across the valley, a coalition of forces assembled, their numbers swelling to nearly 60,000 brave souls, drawn from every corner of Japan. At the heart of the army stood Otomo Soren, his eyes gleaming with determination as he surveyed the battlefield. The two armies drew closer, blood and resentment heating to a boil among Tokugawa's ranks. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and the earth trembled beneath the thunderous hooves of charging steeds. Portuguese cannons screamed into the air, met by fierce resistance from the cohesive ranks of Tokugawa's army. On their flanks, the loyalist clans charged from the north, but failed to inflict heavy losses on their enemies. The Date clan broke off and attempted to divide Tokugawa's armies, but this maneuver also failed. The coalition began to be pushed back as Tokugawa's forces fought for their lives. The sun now rested high above the battlefield, when suddenly, from the west, a battle cry rang out as the remnants of Mitsunari's forces from the Battle of Sekigahara attacked from behind in one final stand. Taken by surprise, the Tokugawa forces found themselves now surrounded. The battle would end in a Tokugawa defeat, signaling the end of Tokugawa Ieyasu's attempt to unify Japan. What would logically come after such a battle wherein the literal foundations of Japanese feudal society in the most powerful daimyo in feudal Japan were all seemingly wiped out at once, we would see a return to the very chaotic feuding states period. But that's no fun. Instead, I suggest we take a less realistic but more interesting route, a Yosei restoration. In our alternate timeline, following the upheaval and disarray after Tokugawa's defeat, and wanting to protect Japan against foreign interests like the Portuguese, Emperor Go-Josei would reinstate the authority of the emperor over Japan, using his supporters and the Christian daimyo to pacify the remaining opposition. Now we see something like an empire of Japan, tolerant but wary of Christianity, almost 300 years earlier than in our timeline. Otomo Soren would take it upon himself to develop Christianity in Japan, or as it would come to be known, Kirishitan. Japanese Kirishitan develops almost like Catholicism in Ireland, mixing Catholicism and Shintoism in Japan to form a unique Japanese church tradition. They would likely have their own calculation for Easter, their own monastic order, which develops with inspiration from the order of the samurai and Bushido teachings, and even penitentials where confession is made in secret, where penance is a private matter. In order to compromise with the fact that Japan is still somewhat hostile to Christianity, we see the church take on a more private role and separate itself to a degree from the political system of Japan. The emperor would be viewed as ordained by God, not necessarily descended from God himself, but Japanese Christians would still need to prove their loyalty to the imperial system. Perhaps such conditions would foment splits in the Japanese church between those who support the emperor and those who oppose him. Regardless, in our alternate timeline, even with the concessions we've made for the sake of this scenario, I really don't see a way for Christianity to become the dominant religion in Japan just yet. Hideshi would be widespread, yes, and especially influential in the South, but for many at this time, it may be seen as perhaps a ceremonial religion. That is to say, maybe Christian marriages and certain feasts and other ceremonies would catch on as cultural events, but they would be assimilated into Japanese culture and would not significantly change Japan's identity. Some interesting notes as we step further into the future. I'd say that in this alternate timeline, the Yosei Restoration isn't as successful as the Meiji Restoration, just due to the lack of communications technology and how early the unification of Japan under the emperor is occurring. It's obviously impossible to predict, but under a subsequent emperor, the political situation in Japan might change, or a new emperor might not care, and power may devolve in some form back to regional leaders, even if the empire is outwardly a unified state. Nevertheless, we're going to continue on essentially assuming the Yosei Restoration is similar to the Meiji, and the Empire of Japan is a coherent and cohesive force in geopolitics. This is unrealistic, as I've outlined, but for the sake of having some material to work with for our predictions going forward, we're going to have to deal with this slightly unrealistic premise. Since our point of divergence begins after Toyotomi launches the invasion of Korea, Japan would still have to finish off the failed Korean campaigns in this alternate timeline. What I see occurring directly after the Yosei Restoration is that Emperor Go-Josei, in an effort to get these strange, meddling, but still loyal Christians from having too much influence in the government, has Soren and the southern Christian daimyo take up the reins in Korea and launch a third, slower-paced invasion. It makes sense too, since the southern daimyo are right there, at the shortest distance between Japan and the Korean peninsula. The southern daimyo, Mori, and other clans' forces fighting in Korea would have to contend with intense resistance from the Koreans and Korea's minor assistance from Ming China. With the potential for the Japanese to use Western-inspired ships and perhaps a tactical change with Soren in command, we'd see a change in success in this third altercation with Korea. Soren, as a military commander, had several cards up his sleeve. He integrated firearm use and firearm training into his soldiers more than any other daimyo of the era, thanks to his early adoption of Western weapons. He was also better trained in naval tactics, which were sorely lacking in Toyotomi's two previous campaigns in Korea. If Soren is able to win in Korea, maybe at a slower pace, but with a longer-term plan that sees greater success and cohesion among the invading forces, perhaps we see a far more assimilated into Japan and more Christianized Korea. Christianized perhaps not to the point of a majority Christian peninsula, but a Korea which sees demographically large and influential Christian and Japanese minorities. Politically, the immediate results of this scenario's changes see Japan developing a close relationship with Iberia. They'd likely initially refuse to trade with the Dutch or the British, and once the Iberian nations began to decline, perhaps our alternate Japan would turn inward again and follow a similar period of isolation. When the Americans would then open up Japan in 1853, they'd find an empire with a vast minority of Christians, which had adopted and modified familiar Western customs. An empire which was more accustomed to Western weapons and tactics. For the sake of not having to reimagine 200 years of history, let's say Japan doesn't industrialize until America enters the picture, following a somewhat similar path as in our own timeline. We're going to go quickly through these changes since I've been rambling for long enough as it is. Japan would probably still harbor resentment towards the USA, especially due to Protestant-Catholic divides, and the Catholic Japanese Christians would view the Protestant Americans with suspicion and cultural disdain, intensifying the friction as America begins to exert influence in the region. The USA, after all, still did show up unannounced in their big black boats with their big noses and strange costumes to open up the country economically. The Americans themselves would just see a somewhat Christian but culturally unique Japan and would still try to foster a trade relationship with the empire. Moving on through the 19th century, I'd say the fundamental geopolitical interests that led to the Russo-Japanese War would likely still exist. Japan would want to retain its influence in Korea and Manchuria, and would find itself in direct competition with Russia. Having adopted Western weapons and tactics earlier due to its relationship with Iberia, Japan might even be better prepared for modern warfare by the time of the Russo-Japanese War, leading to an even more decisive victory. But we could also see a more protracted conflict if Japan is too confident in its own abilities, and also depending on the level of preparation on the part of the Japanese and the Russians. Japan's response to the Boxer Rebellion and Taiping Rebellion in China could be a more interventionist one. A Japan with a strong Christian minority might feel a more religious and moral imperative to support Christians in China during the Boxer Rebellion, as well as the Spanish and maybe Italian consulates in Beijing. Japan already played a huge role in the Boxer Rebellion, and now there's just a bit more at stake in the game for the Japanese. I don't see Japanese Christians rallying to support the Taiping movement, though, given how strange and uniquely Chinese it was. The Taiping Rebellion might just be an excuse for Japan to exert more influence over northern China, and maybe even present itself as an ally to Christians in China seeking to undermine the Qing. It's a messy situation, but I really don't see the Japanese taking a huge interest in the Taiping Rebellion compared to the Boxer Rebellion. Japan's involvement in World War I would, you guessed it, likely be similar, as the motivations for joining the Allies would remain unchanged. However, I wonder how Japan would act during the interwar period. Would the Japanese Empire still take on a highly militarist and somewhat xenophobic tone as it did in our timeline? Could the significant Christian minority in Japan and Korea influence Japanese policy, or would they just be disregarded? Could the emperor or those in command of the military and in positions of authority be themselves Christian? After all, Christianity spread in Japan like wildfire after the Meiji Restoration in our timeline, and with less hindrance to the development of Kira-Shitan in this alternate timeline, maybe Christianity becomes a more powerful force in Japanese government, or even in the Japanese imperial line. Only time can tell for sure. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you really liked the video. Thanks for the time. This has been the USFC signing out.